Binding Vows, the most complicated part of an already ridiculously complicated power system. A pact made with Jujutsu that either creates conditions for oneself or an agreement with others. An essential tenet of Jujutsu sorcery that either paves the way for the suppression of ridiculously powerful foes or busts open doors to the unlocking of true potentials. But what happens when this highly variable part of a ridiculously rigid power system gets cranked to 11? Well, people start to complain. See, because while JJK and Gege Akutami undoubtedly pride themselves on having the most complicated power system in modern day anime and manga, unfortunately as JJK came to its sputtering end, the Binding Vows seemingly became an emergency release button for Gege Akutami every single time he wrote himself into a corner, specifically when it comes to Sukuna. But is Sukuna the worst offender when it comes to using Binding Vows to get out of sticky situations, or is he just accessing a part of the power system that many before him had accessed, just seemingly in a tighter timeline? Well, today I'm going to answer that question and a whole lot more, because today we're talking every single Binding Vow ever made in JJK explained, so we can not only better understand what Binding Vows are and how they exist in this universe, but also who's used them, how they've used them, and if Sukuna's usage of them was egregious. But before we get to passing judgment on JJK's vows, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video a week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're in the forest of death, and Sasuke is pulling people's arms off. So, Binding Vows. There's two kinds of them. There is vows with oneself and vows with others. Now, by far and away, vows with oneself are the more common kind of vows in JJK. One, because obviously it's easier to do something with yourself than with somebody else, ask 12-year-old Nick. And two, because the repercussions of breaking a vow with yourself is just the loss of a thing that you made that vow to gain. However, this doesn't mean that binding vows with oneself aren't dangerous. See, self-imposed binding vows can be potentially harmful to the person imposing them on themselves. Like how Nanami limits his cursed energy output down to 80% between the hours of 9 to 5, so that when he goes into overtime post 5 p.m., it goes up to 120. This self-imposed limitation does technically put Nanami in danger between the hours of 9 to 5, but because he's usually working between the hours of 9 to 5 and not being a sorcerer, it kind of works out. On top of this, as cursed energy as a power system is roughly based off Nen, there's also the underlying rule with binding vows imposed on oneself that since cursed energy is the product of negative emotions and cursed energy responds to the desires of the individual user, if said individual user makes a situation riskier for themselves, their cursed energy will actually swell in response to that risk, because with that additional risk comes fear and anger and apprehension, all negative emotions. And thus that brings us to the first binding vow we're going to talk about today, revealing one's hands. See, essentially, this binding vow operates by a sorcerer revealing how their curse technique works. So if you're fighting against Todo, and Todo tells you that when I clap my hands, I'm able to switch locations with somebody, technically in response to the fact that I now know that information about how his curse technique works, his curse technique, Boogie Woogie, will get stronger. Now, obviously, this is a double-edged sword. See, because even though while Todo now has more cursed energy that he can funnel into his Boogie Woogie to possibly swap locations more often or faster, I know that when Todo claps his hands together that he's going to swap locations with somebody or something. However, skilled Jujutsu sorcerers know just how much information they need to give away to an opponent to get this cursed energy swell, but also mislead their opponent, not showing their entire hand. And this is once again best displayed with Todo, because Todo doesn't need to swap locations every single time he claps. However, he can trick somebody into thinking that he does swap locations every single time he claps, simply by revealing the bare minimum about his technique. Now, every single sorcerer in JJK does this, even if it's not being explicitly acknowledged. This right here is technically a writing tool used by a lot of mangakas that gives an in-universe explanation as to why every single sorcerer is explaining exactly how their technique works in the heat of battle. It's no longer yammering or exposition. Now it's them increasing their power by revealing one's hand, which is why we get to know so much about the curse techniques of all of the main characters of this story, like Nanami, whose binding vow we've already touched on. Nanami's binding vow, overtime, limits his cursed energy output to 80 to 90% while he's on the clock working for Jujutsu High. However, once his normal shift is over, if he's still working, then he's able to clock into over time, where he's able to tap into 110 to 120% of his maximum output of cursed energy. Now, this is pretty much the best example of how a binding vow should work in the JJK universe. Something is being given up for a certain amount of time, so the equal amount of that thing can be gained at a different time. It's fair, it's reasonable, it makes sense. It's the perfect example of how binding vows should operate in the JJK universe. However, there's no set rules on how a binding vow should work in the JJK universe. There is no equivalent exchange, and therefore, while Nanami's binding vow may seem fair, unfortunately, as we go deeper and deeper into the story, it appears as though either people give up way too much to get what they get from a binding vow, or they don't give up nearly enough. And maybe that has to do with the strength of the person using the binding vow, which is a great segue to our third binding vow, which revolves around Miwa. See, Kazumi Miwa from the Kyoto Jujutsu High shows off to us a rather interesting binding vow pretty early in JJK. See, Miwa is untalented, like uniquely untalented. However, she is able to use simple domain, something that actually, rather surprisingly, very few people in the JJK universe can do, as simple domain is a technique that was monopolized by the new Shadow style school, and therefore, in order to learn simple domain, which is a lot of sorcerers' only response to the expansion of somebody else's domain, basically have to sign your soul away to the new Shadow style school. However, Miwa was able to get around entering the new Shadow style school, and was able to learn simple domain by making a binding vow with herself that stated she would be able to activate simple domain so long as her feet remained planted in the exact spot that they were when she activated simple domain. Now, Miwa ends up using this as a way to increase her Iai jutsu. That is to say, like Nobunaga and Hunter x Hunter, she expands simple domain around herself, and anybody who enters her simple domain, she's able to sense immediately and slice with her sword. However, should Miwa move her feet even a little bit, her simple domain ends. Another fair and relatively balanced binding vow. Miwa, a relatively weak sorcerer, gets to do something that she otherwise wouldn't be able to do under some pretty strict rules. And if she breaks said rules by moving her feet, then boom, simple domain gone. Cool, easy, good. I get it. Unfortunately, things are about to get substantially more complicated, because the next binding vow we're going to talk about is a binding vow a lot of you probably didn't even know happened. See, when Mahito entered his final form, or his instant spirit body of distorted killing form, yes, that's its actual name, he made a binding vow with himself to increase his toughness in this final form, with the promise that he wouldn't use idle transfiguration on himself to change himself ever again. Now, technically, because this is a self-imposed binding vow, Mahito is able to just get rid of this binding vow whenever he wants, and all that he loses is the toughness of that final form. And if that's infuriating to you, then yeah, same. Because basically, this is the first time that anybody in JJK imposed something on themselves that gave them an additive bonus that they would lose once they stopped using the form that they gave that additive bonus to. Basically, what Mahito is saying here, because he is able to break his own binding vow whenever he wants, is I won't change out of this form, and therefore this form should be stronger. But he still has the ability to change out of that form. We all saw how he died, and all he lost from changing out of that form was that that form was no longer tough. But considering the fact that he wasn't using that form anymore, that form wouldn't be tough anyways. And to add insult to injury here, there is a separate binding vow on this form that also allows for Mahito to transfigure his elbows and face tendrils at will. So he is still able to transfigure parts of his body. And unfortunately, when it comes down to it, this is kind of just how binding vows work for the bad guys. There's concrete set rules and give and take when a good guy wants to use a binding vow. But if a bad guy wants to use one, well, I don't know. Don't go to Ruby Tuesdays on Wednesdays and you'll get a third arm. And this is no better exemplified than with Miwa, who once again, like, uniquely untalented. But Miwa made a binding vow with herself that she would never swing a katana again in order to increase the strength of this one final sword draw attack that she was launching at Pseudo Ghetto, or Kenjaku. The kind of binding vow that you would assume would massively buff the power of somebody like Miwa, whose entire kit is predicated on using a katana. Essentially what she's saying here is that after this sword swing, I will give up being a Jujutsu sorcerer, kind of like what Gon did to become an adult. And yet, what does she accomplish in this moment? Her sword getting caught barehanded. Now, is it because Kenjaku was insanely powerful and Miwa is uniquely untalented? Yeah, probably. But I mean, like, my God, let the girl draw blood at least. But sometimes the good guys do get good binding vows, but only if they're lucky, and no one's luckier than Kinji Hikari. See, in Hikari's legendary fight against Kashimo, Hikari makes an impromptu binding vow. A binding vow that essentially states that Hikari will sacrifice his left arm to survive an explosion created by Kashimo. And this is a pretty insane binding vow. I mean, Hikari is willingly sacrificing his left arm, and without his left arm, he can't open his his domain, Idle Death Gamble. And without the opening of his domain, he can't become invincible for 4 minutes and regrow said lost arm. However, because Hikari is making such a big sacrifice in the lopping off of his left arm, he's able to transfer the curse energy that would have protected that left arm to the rest of his body and save himself from the explosion made by Kashima. Makes sense, right? Hikari had to lose something in order to gain something. And the something that he lost was pretty substantial, but that's okay when you consider the fact that it allowed him to survive something he otherwise wouldn't have survived. See, binding vows aren't that bad. Oh wait, we just got to the Sukuna part of the list. The next three, yes, 3 binding vows we're going to talk about are binding vows that Sukuna made with himself either during his battle against Gojo or the people he fought after Gojo. And I'm going to be real with you. I'm probably going to get angry. I apologize in advance. See, the first of the 3 binding vows we're going to talk about from Sukuna came during his battle against Gojo, towards the end of his battle against Gojo, actually. See, Sukuna has an ability that's referred to as the world-cutting dismantle, a technique that allows for Sukuna to basically cut through anything on Earth. However, because this curse technique is so incredibly powerful, it usually requires hand signs and chants, like Gojo saying 9 ropes, whatever the hell, to fire off his purple. Except because Sukuna is Sukuna, his world-cutting slash actually only needed hand signs and not incantations. However, in the final moments of Sukuna's battle against Gojo, he decided he wanted to bypass the activation conditions to fire off a world-cutting dismantle, and thus Sukuna made a binding vow to further complicate all future uses of the world-cutting dismantle, meaning that the next time that he wanted to be able to use it, its firing would actually require incantations. And on top of that, he would have to direct the trajectory with a 3rd arm. Now, this all sounds pretty fair, and objectively, out of all of the self-imposed binding vows that Sukuna does, this one is the most fair. He gets something relatively mundane, which is the firing off of the world-cutting dismantle for the low cost of just having to do some incantations for all the next times that he wants to use it, and that's pretty even. Skip the line for this ride once, but the next time that you want to ride this ride, the line is a little bit longer. Here's the problem though. While Sukuna hadn't yet undergone his transformation into his true form, he does pretty much immediately after this. And in Sukuna's true form, he's considered the perfect sorcerer, with 4 arms to do hand signs and 2 mouths to do incantations. Now, it's not described to us that Sukuna underwent this binding vow to be able to cut Gojo in the moment that he cuts Gojo, rather until like 20 chapters later, when Sukuna already has 4 arms and 2 mouths. Because with a binding vow that Sukuna made when he had 2 arms, saying that he wouldn't be able to use his world-cutting dismantle unless he had 3 arms to guide the trajectory, makes a lot of sense when you consider how much he got from it, because effectively he wouldn't be able to use his world-cutting dismantle unless he underwent his transformation. Therefore, in that form, his Megami form, he'd never be able to use it again. And saying, oh, I'll never be able to use this very powerful technique ever again, should increase the power of that technique a lot, unless your name is Miwa. Effectively, he gained an insane amount of power that allowed for him to cut through infinity for the low cost of basically nothing. Because on top of the fact that Sukuna was able to fire this world-cutting dismantle without an activation clause, it also increased the power of that world-cutting dismantle to be able to slice through Gojo's infinity. Now, 3 minutes after Sukuna did that, he grew 2 additional arms and an additional mouth that made him using that world-cutting dismantle basically as easy as it was before. Don't worry, it gets worse. The next of the self-imposed Sukuna binding vows that we're going to talk about is maybe the worst explained out of any of the binding vows in all of JJK. Because, and I'm gonna have to read this whole page here to help you and myself understand what's going on here. It's page 1 of chapter 258. Satoru Gojo constructed a unique reverse curse technique circuit while in an awakened state resulting from 2 black flashes. He distributed the function and its burden to a part of his brain in a different way than usual, thereby recovering lost reverse curse technique output. In the same way, the King of Curses regenerated his arm to thrash the sorcerers of Jujutsu High. At least that's what he intended. Yuta Chijori drove 7 black flashes into the boundary between Megami Fushiguro and Ryumen Sukuna's souls, causing Ryumen Sukuna to miss his chance to recover his reverse curse technique. Then, on the very next page, right after we've established that Sukuna has not recovered his reverse curse technique, and therefore should not have the brain function to open his domain expansion, we see Sukuna open his domain expansion. But how'd he do that, Nick? I'll read you the explanation, if you can even call it that, Gege Akutami gave us. A chain Change of Palm Signs, a curse technique with a part of the brain unaffected by unlimited void, and the operation of a barrier technique. Having survived the Black Flashes, Ryum and Sukuna generated Malevolent Shrine without a decrease in effective area or output throughout imprecise elements and an impromptu binding vow. Let me read that again for you. Through imprecise elements and an impromptu binding vow. Wait, don't you have to give something up in order to get something using a binding vow? Well, so far as I can understand, and trust me, I've read this chapter multiple times, what Sukuna gives up is that he's just able to use Malevolent Shrine for 99 seconds. Now, like, the pseudo explanation they give is, even with his back against the wall, Ryum and Sukuna isn't lowering the difficulty of this barrier technique. As in Shibuya, he isn't using a barrier to divide his effective range in the outside world. Covering the domain with a barrier's external shell provides an escape route. I don't understand what they're saying there at all. Sukuna's domain expansion inherently doesn't have a barrier technique around it because he wants to increase his range. This means he can walk in and walk out of Sukuna's domain expansion, which is exactly what he does in Shibuya. So I don't know how covering the domain with the barrier's external shell provides an escape route. I don't understand that sentence at all. Chapter goes on to say, the binding vow disappears, the effective range shrinks, and the domain specifications change, and the guaranteed hit activates within the manifested landscape of mental imagery, which just means the domain expansion. That's an overcomplicated way to explain that. But basically what's being established here is that Maki, who doesn't have cursed energy, cannot be hit by the Malevolent Shrine auto attack, and Sukuna is only able to use Malevolent Shrine for 99 seconds. And all he had to do to be able to use Malevolent Shrine for 99 seconds, which is more than enough time to kill anybody, was to change his hand seal and direct curse energy through a different part of his brain not affected by unlimited void that he had been hit with earlier. What's he giving up there? Great question. Objectively nothing. He gives up objectively nothing and gets to open his domain expansion, which is one of the strongest domain expansions at full power and full range for 99 seconds, which is more than enough time to kill basically anyone in it. But don't worry, not done, because the next binding vow we're going to talk about is also Sukuna. See, Sukuna's got a technique called Divine Flame. It's a fire arrow. And to make Divine Flame more effective, because apparently the fire curse technique that was strong enough to kill the curse spirit made from the fear of volcanoes wasn't strong enough, Sukuna made a binding vow with himself that he wouldn't use Divine Flame against multiple people unless multiple people were in his domain. So if you and two buddies are fighting against Sukuna and he wants to use Divine Flame against all three of you, well, he can't do that unless he opens his domain. Now, you know, Sukuna's only ever used Divine Flame like 2 or 3 times before this moment. One to kill Maharaga, one to kill Jogo, and I think maybe one other time, but maybe not, as he prefers to only use the requisite amount of cursed energy necessary to kill people. But sure, now Sukuna can't use Divine Flame against multiple people unless he's in his domain, which he has no difficulty opening even if he's not supposed to be able to. That's a pretty big takeaway. What does he get from it? Well, his domain expansion range is extended, and every piece of rubble within the 200-meter diameter of his ridiculously huge domain expansion. Terrible news here. Yeah, it's all imbued with explosive cursed energy, turning every single dust particle in the entirety of this massive domain expansion into basically a thermobaric explosive that's triggered by his Divine Flame. So yeah, this is tough, but everything within that domain expansion basically immediately evaporated by, you know, like a Tokyo level firebombing. Don't worry, Divine Flame that Sukuna's only ever used against singular opponents, mind you, can no longer be used on multiple opponents. You know, unless they're in his domain. And you want to know the most aggravating part about these 3 binding vows? The only penalty for breaking a binding vow you make with yourself is the loss of what you gained. So if Sukuna a week down the line was to use Divine Flame against multiple people outside of his domain, all that he would lose is that when he uses Divine Flame in his domain expansion, everything doesn't blow up anymore. None of the binding vows that Sukuna makes with himself have any lasting consequences. But fortunately, people started using binding vows against Sukuna, and they started working, like, really well. Which is gonna bring us to the next binding vow we're talking about today, Boogie Woogie Revised. Which, if we're being real, is also a kind of a bullshit binding vow. I'm calling out everybody on both sides here. See, Toto loses his left hand in the battle against Mahito. But Toto's like, I don't think Boogie Woogie's done with me quite yet. And so he replaces his hand with a Vibra Slap. And with that Vibra Slap, Toto is now able to do 50 swaps per second, which is not only insane, but also highly unnecessary. But because 50 swaps per second is ridiculous and highly unnecessary, and because when you slap a vibra slap, the piece of wood is going to hit the piece of metal multiple times, Toto was able to make a binding vow that limited the amount of swaps he was able to do per strike of wood on metal. And because he was placing this highly restrictive rule on him that probably only let him swap something like 30 to 40 times a second, he was able to increase the range of his boogie woogie and also select multiple targets, meaning in just one strike of his boogie woogie, he could swap 3 targets as opposed to his standard 2. So something gained and something lost. If Toto tried to use the requisite amount of swaps per strike, his range would be lessened and he'd only be able to swap 1 person at a time. Now that binding vow itself isn't all that ridiculous, it's just the fact that Toto could swap 50 times a second that is. But with that brings us to our final binding vow that somebody makes with themselves in JJK. And this one is with Yuji. And this one makes a lot of sense. It's maybe the most sensical binding vow ever made. Outside of Nanami's is like the gold standard. Yuji, with a binding vow, narrows down the target of his dismantle. Yes, he has dismantle because of how long Sukuna was inside of him, so that it's only able to target the boundary between an incarnated sorcerer's cursed object and the soul of the person that they're controlling. Because of this dismantle is effectively useless against somebody who's not a reincarnated sorcerer. It doesn't do physical damage, it does soul damage. It separates the soul from the sorcerer. Now, this binding vow was obviously done by Yuji, so he'd be able to separate Sukuna's soul from Megami's. And this binding vow made Yuji's dismantle massively more effective against Sukuna. In addition, this binding vow also made Yuji very useful after the conclusion of the culling games, because Yuji worked along with Hana to separate the reincarnated sorcerers from the people who they took over. So, something gained, something lost. That's how it works, or at least how it should work. There's, like I said, not really a whole lot of rules. And with that, that's all of the vows made with oneself, which are objectively the worst kind of binding vows. Because in the second kind of binding vows, a binding vow made with somebody else, the repercussions of breaking that vow are so severe that nobody dared do it. It's a new day. I had to go get dinner with a friend. It was very good. Anyways, there's only 5 known binding vows that took place between 2 people. And all of them lead to pretty substantially large upgrades in comparison to binding vows made with oneself. Most likely because of the risk associated with breaking these binding vows. The first binding vow that we ever see between 2 people is the binding vow that takes place between Sukuna and Yuji. And this binding vow came about after Yuji died. Now, in order to make sure that the MC of the story did not die, Sukuna made a binding vow promise with Yuji that stated that he would bring Yuji back to life by using reverse curse technique to essentially grow Yuji a new heart, something that we know Sukuna does not need to survive, so long as Yuji allowed for Sukuna to take over Yuji's body for 1 minute every single time he said in chain. Now, obviously, Yuji didn't want this, so he challenged Sukuna to a fight and said that this binding vow would be able to go through if Yuji lost, which he did, all but immediately. Now, there was an additional condition to this binding vow that stated that during this 1 minute, Sukuna wouldn't kill anybody, so long as Yuji forgot that this binding vow was ever created in the first place. However, this don't kill / injure anybody else during this 1 minute rule doesn't apply to Yuji, which is why Sukuna was able to rip off one of Yuji's fingers and shove it into Megami's mouth to switch to Megami as a host. Now, in the hypothetical circumstance where Sukuna were to kill somebody while controlling Yuji's body for this 1 minute, it's not like Yuji's heart would explode. But that being said, we don't necessarily know what would happen. Sukuna would, at the very least, lose his ability to take over Yuji's body by saying in chain, but there's also the possibility that even more dire consequences would be imposed upon Sukuna. And these dire consequences is why nobody really dares to break a binding vow they made with somebody else, even if they believe themselves to be substantially stronger than the person they made a binding vow with. And this is best displayed with the second binding vow that we see take place between 2 parties, which is the binding vow between Kokichi Muta and Mahito. Now, this contract saw Kokichi acting as a double agent against the Jujutsu Society for Pseudo-Geto and Mahito. Basically, Kokichi was feeding Pseudo-Geto and Mahito information about the movings of the Jujutsu Society, with the caveat that regardless of the information that was fed to Mahito or Geto, that neither of them would ever lay a finger on all of the members from the Kyoto Jujutsu High. And after Kokichi fed enough information to Geto and Mahito, Mahito used his idol transfiguration to heal Kokichi's body, as Kokichi was bored with glass bones and paper skin. Now, Kokichi does technically allege that this contract was broken, because in the Tokyo versus Kyoto Jujutsu High tournament, Team Curse Spirit does pull up on the event, and they do injure a couple of the members of Kyoto High. However, Mahito rebukes this point and says it was actually Hanami who battled against members of Kyoto High, and therefore, as the promise was simply that Mahito and Pseudo-Geto would not lay a finger on members of the Kyoto High, technically Hanami battling against them did not break the agreement of the binding vow, and therefore we don't get to see what the repercussions or blowback of a binding vow between two people being broken would do. And thus it brings us back to this all-important question of how exactly do binding vows work? How much information did Kokichi need to feed to Geto and Mahito? And do both parties have to agree that a binding vow between the two of them has been broken? For the repercussions of this broken vow to be launched back on the person who broke the rules? We can't really say. However, we can infer, since Mahito was able to explain away how the rules weren't actually broken, that the repercussions shouldn't be launched back against him. However, we do know that when Mahito was talking to Geto about how they probably just shouldn't even heal Kokichi at all, Geto told Mahito that not healing Kokichi and breaking this binding vow could be potentially dangerous, if not deadly. Therefore, even though Mahito and Geto were massively more powerful than Kokichi, they went through with their end of the contract. But if binding vows between the good guys and the bad guys makes you uncomfortable, well, wait until you hear about this next one, because the next binding vow between two people we gotta talk about is between Wee and Mei. See, because these two walking agents of discomfort have a binding vow between the two of them where Wee limits his cursed energy output until Mei gives him permission to use his cursed energy at its fullest potential. Now, this effectively works like Nanami's overtime binding vow, where because Wee is usually walking around with his cursed energy so massively suppressed that whenever Mei does give him permission to use his cursed energy output is multiplied many times over, allowing Wee's cursed energy output to dwarf that of his grade 1 sorcerer sister. And while that binding vow makes a lot of sense, still makes me uncomfortable. But if that binding vow made a whole lot of sense to you, just wait a second, because they get more complicated, especially this next one. Because up next, we're talking about the binding vow that Kenjaku made with all of the reincarnated sorcerers. See, Kenjaku's been alive for thousands of years, like at least 1,000. And over the course of those 1,000 years, Kenjaku hunted down incredibly powerful sorcerers, like Kashimo. And he made a binding vow with all of these crazy powerful sorcerers that said essentially that if Kenjaku took a part of them, he'd be able to turn that into a cursed object that he could feed to a marked non-sorcerer way down the line that would allow for that sorcerer to take over that person's body and join the culling games. And then at the end of the Shibuya incident, after Geto absorbed Mahito, he remotely casts idle transfiguration on all of the minds of the marked sorcerers, or soon-to-be sorcerers, to adjust their brains to now make them sorcerers. Because there was two kinds of sorcerers that were introduced into the culling games. Non-sorcerers who consumed a cursed object that allowed for them to become reincarnated sorcerers, and non-sorcerers who had brains that would allow them to be sorcerers if only their brain chemistry was kind of swapped up a little bit. And thus this idle transfiguration not only allowed for Geto to swap the brain chemistry of those who could have been sorcerers but didn't have the correct brains for them, turning them into awakened sorcerers like Takaba, but also he was able to alter the brain chemistry of those he had marked to increase their strength as hosts for the 1,000 reincarnated sorcerers he brought into the culling games. All because of the binding vows that he had made with sorcerers over the last 1,000 years, wandering around Japan trying to find the strongest sorcerers for his culling game. Got it? Good. We're moving on. The last out of all of the binding vows that we need to talk about today is the binding vow that took place between Yuta Akotsu and the Jujutsu higher-ups. A binding vow that anime-only watchers are going to see put into action at the very beginning of Season 3 of JJK. A binding vow that Yuta had to make with the Jujutsu higher-ups that stated that he would kill Yuji. Now, this binding vow was made to ensure that Yuta would kill Yuji, and if he backed out of it, he would face dire consequences. However, once again truly highlighting that there is many ways to weasel out of a binding vow, Yuta does kill Yuji. However, immediately after killing Yuji, he uses reverse curse technique to bring Yuji back to life, resuscitating him, not only completing the binding vow he made with the higher-ups, but also essentially taking the target off Yuji's back. And with that, that's every binding vow that ever takes place in JJK. So were a disproportionate amount of them done by Sukuna? Maybe. And do the rules of binding vows seemingly only apply to people not named Sukuna or Mahito? Yeah. Also maybe. And did the introduction of this very variable part of a very rigid power system weaken the power system as a whole? Also kind of yeah, maybe. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Do you believe that binding vows were a good or bad addition to JJK as a whole? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. No more tomatoes on my burgers on Wednesdays, but I get to rip out the heart of everybody in a mile radius.